she found a wounded Marshal with arrow in his back. At dawn, the bounty hunters came for him. Meryl had always been alone on the ranch. She preferred it that way. Quiet, peaceful, with nothing but the wind sweeping across the dusty plains to keep her company. The world was a rough place out here, and her ranch was the only thing that gave her a sense of purpose. Raised in the harsh world of the frontier, she was no stranger to the struggles of surviving in this unforgiving land. But nothing could have prepared her for what she found on this particular morning. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, painting the sky a soft orange when Meryl set out to check her traps. The air was crisp and dry, typical for the desert morning. The dry grass crunched beneath her boots as she walked, and the only sound was the distant cry of a lone hawk. It was a peaceful morning, until she spotted the body. At first, she thought it was a rock or a pile of brush, but as she drew closer, she saw the unmistakable shape of a man lying motionless in the dirt. His boots were caked with mud, and his coat was torn, revealing the sharp edge of an old, rusty sheriff's star pinned to his chest. Meryl's heart skipped a beat as she knelt beside him. His face was pale, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. He was a Marshal by the looks of his badge, but there was something different about him. The deep wound in his back, an arrow lodged just beneath his shoulder, was unlike anything she had ever seen. The arrowhead was crude, jagged, and covered in what looked like dried blood. She had heard stories of outlaws using such arrows, but she had never thought she'd see one up close. Meryl's mind raced. She could tell by the way the man lay there, barely holding on, that time was running out. She had to act quickly. She didn't know if this Marshal was a lawman or an outlaw, but one thing was certain. He was hurt, and he needed help. Gritting her teeth, Meryl pulled him gently from the dirt, wincing as she touched his back. She could feel the heat of his fevered body, and the blood, thick and sticky, was already staining her hands. He wasn't going to last much longer like this. Her eyes scanned the horizon. There was no sign of anyone nearby, just the endless stretch of land and the occasional gust of wind. She couldn't leave him here. If she did, he'd surely die alone in the dust. But taking him back to her ranch, that was a risk. There were plenty of people out here who wouldn't take kindly to a stranger, especially one wearing a sheriff's badge. But it was too late to turn back now. With all the strength she could muster, Meryl lifted the man into her arms and started walking toward the shack that had been her home for the past few years. It wasn't much, just a small wooden structure with a single room and a tin roof, but it was better than nothing. The journey back to her shack felt like an eternity. The sun was rising higher in the sky now, and Meryl's sweat mixed with the dust on her face. Her muscles screamed from the weight of the injured man, but she pushed through, determined to get him to safety. The trek was long, but when she finally reached the shack, she was out of breath, her hands trembling with exhaustion. The Marshal's breathing was more erratic now, and his skin had a pale, almost grayish tint. Once inside, Meryl set him down on the rough wooden floor. His body slumped, and for a moment she thought he might have passed out again. But then he coughed, a harsh, rattling sound that made her heart skip a beat. "Stay with me," she muttered to herself, as she quickly rummaged through her supplies. She had a basic first aid kit, but she had never dealt with anything this serious before. The arrow wound was deep, and the blood was still flowing, even though the man's body had already started to shut down. She needed to stop the bleeding, and fast. Meryl took a deep breath, her mind working through the steps. First, she needed to remove the arrow. She looked at the wound, wincing. This wasn't going to be easy. The arrowhead was wedged deep into the man's flesh, and she could see it was lodged against a bone. With a steady hand, she grabbed a pair of rusty pliers from the shelf and carefully gripped the end of the arrow. She pulled it out slowly, knowing any sudden movement would make things worse. The Marshal groaned in pain, his eyes flickering open, but he couldn't seem to focus. "Don't move," she whispered, as she worked quickly to clean the wound. The man's eyes fluttered as if he was trying to speak, but his words were nothing more than a jumbled mess. Meryl couldn't make sense of it. He was delirious, his fever rising. Once she had cleaned the wound and wrapped it as best she could with the bandages she had, Meryl paused to catch her breath. She glanced down at the Marshal, wondering if he would survive this. He was tough, that much was clear. But how long would it take for him to recover? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound outside. It was faint at first, but then louder. Hooves, moving fast. Meryl's pulse quickened as she looked toward the window. She couldn't see anyone, but she knew that whoever was coming wasn't in a hurry to make friends. The land out here didn't belong to the law. And with a lawman in her care, she was about to find out just how dangerous this day would get. The Marshal was barely conscious now, his eyes closed again. She wiped the sweat from her brow, staring out the window as the sound of the horses grew louder. There was no turning back now. Meryl had a feeling that the trouble she had just stumbled into was far worse than a simple injury. There was something about this man, about his badge and the arrow in his back, that suggested he wasn't just a lawman. He was running from something, or someone, and that something was coming for him. With a sigh, Meryl stood up, moving toward the door. She didn't know who was out there, but one thing was certain: she wasn't about to let anyone take this man without a fight. Meryl stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon, watching the dust rise in the distance. The sound of hooves grew louder with every passing moment. Her hand instinctively reached for the revolver strapped to her hip. It was a comforting weight, but she knew it wouldn't be enough if things went sideways. This wasn't just some band of thieves or marauders. No, this was something different. She could feel it in the air, thick with danger, something that sent a chill down her spine. The marshal stirred behind her, his fevered breath rasping in the otherwise silent shack. He was barely conscious, his face pale and slick with sweat. The wound in his back was still oozing blood, but she had done what she could to stop it. The bandages were holding for now, but Meryl knew time wasn't on their side. He had to be moved, and soon. She turned her attention back to the window. Whoever was coming, they weren't riding casually. They were coming fast, and they weren't going to stop until they found what they were looking for. Meryl's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to steady her breath. There was no mistaking it. These weren't just ordinary travelers. They were bounty hunters. From the stories she'd heard in the local tavern and whispered around campfires, bounty hunters were the stuff of legends. Ruthless men and women who hunted down the most dangerous criminals in the frontier. But this wasn't the usual kind of outlaw she'd heard of. This was something different, something more dangerous. And the marshal was right in the middle of it. His name, when he had managed to mutter it through his delirium, was Marshal Walker. He had been chasing a group of outlaws, a gang who had been terrorizing settlements across the galaxy. These weren't your run-of-the-mill criminals. No, these were spacefaring bandits, well-funded and highly organized. They had been causing chaos across the system, and Walker had been on their trail for months. But something had gone wrong, and now here he was, lying in her shack, barely alive, with bounty hunters on his tail. Meryl bit her lip, her mind racing. What should she do? She couldn't just let them find him. Podcasting that I could do about it. So please don't say that I would podcast much after everything he had done to protect these lands. She had seen the way he fought when he had come to, the fire in his eyes despite the pain. He wasn't just any lawman, he was a man on a mission, and now it seemed she was caught up in it. Her hand tightened around the handle of the revolver, but she knew that wasn't enough. It would take more than a few shots to stop a group of experienced bounty hunters. She needed to think, and fast. The horses grew louder, their hooves thundering on the hard ground. She couldn't waste any more time. Meryl quickly turned, crossing the room to where Walker lay. His breathing was shallow, but he was still alive. For now. She grabbed his jacket and gently shook him. "Walker," she whispered, her voice low but firm. "You need to wake up, they're coming." His eyes fluttered open and he groaned, struggling to focus. I'm not going to make it," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to make it," Meryl replied with more confidence than she felt. "But we need to move. There's a group of bounty hunters coming for you, and we can't stay here." The marshal's eyes widened slightly, and his hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "You don't understand. They won't stop. They'll hunt you down, too." "I don't care about that," Meryl said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "I'm not letting them take you. Not now." She helped him to his feet, his body trembling with pain. Meryl wasn't sure how long he would last on his own, but she couldn't afford to wait and find out. The hunters were close, too close. If she didn't act fast, they would be here before she knew it. With Walker leaning heavily on her, Meryl moved toward the back of the shack. She had a small tunnel that led down to the creek behind her property, a place she had used in the past for emergencies. It was a risky move, but it was their best chance. If they could make it there, they could hide in the dense brush and hopefully lose the bounty hunters in the maze of the canyon. The marshal's steps were slow and unsteady, but Meryl held him up as best as she could. Sweat dripped down her forehead as she pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. They had to make it. The sound of the horses was now deafening, and she knew they were close. As they reached the back door, Meryl glanced out the small window one last time. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw them. 5 riders, all armed and determined, pulling up in front of the shack. The lead rider was a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat, his face hidden in shadow. He wasn't alone, and she knew they weren't going to give up easily. Meryl's hand shot to the door, but before she could open it, Walker stopped her. "Wait," he said, his voice barely audible. "They'll kill you." "I'm not leaving you," she snapped. "Not without a fight." Walker's gaze softened, and for the first time since she found him, he seemed to gather some strength. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that. But listen to me. If they catch us, it's over. You need to go. We're in this together. Now move." She swung the door open, and they stepped out into the cool, early morning air. The sound of the bounty hunters' voices reached them, and Merrill knew they had only seconds before they were discovered. She guided Walker toward the creek, hoping the thick underbrush would shield them. But as they moved, the sound of footsteps crunching on the dry earth behind them stopped them cold. "You're not going anywhere," a voice called out from behind. Merrill's heart sank as she turned to face the bounty hunters. The tall rider with the shadowed face was standing just a few yards away, his weapon aimed directly at her. "You've got two choices," he said, his voice calm but filled with menace. "Step aside or we'll take both of you down." Merrill's grip tightened on the revolver, and she took a deep breath. This wasn't how she had envisioned her morning, but there was no turning back now. The battle for survival had begun. The bounty hunters were closing in fast. Merrill could feel the weight of the revolver in her hand, her fingers gripping it tightly as if it could somehow give her the strength to face what was coming. The tall rider, the leader of the group, stood in front of her, his dark eyes hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat. He was a man of few words, but his posture was menacing enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. "You've got no chance, lady," the bounty hunter said in a cold, gravelly voice. "Move aside, and we might let you live. You keep standing in our way, and it's going to get ugly." Merrill didn't back down. She stood her ground, one hand on the revolver, the other steadying Marshal Walker as he swayed on his feet beside her. He was barely conscious now, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Merrill could see the struggle in his eyes, the silent plea for her to leave, but she wasn't going to leave him to face these men alone. Not now. Not ever. "You won't get him," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. The bounty hunter's lips curled into a sinister smile. "That's not your decision to make, Missy. You don't get to choose." The air between them crackled with tension. Merrill could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat a reminder of how much was at stake. The bounty hunters weren't just here for the Marshal. They were here for the bounty, and they'd do anything to claim it. She couldn't let them take him. Not without a fight. The leader stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of his own weapon, a large, gleaming rifle. His eyes flicked between Merrill and the Marshal. "This is your last warning," he said, his tone dark and dangerous. Merrill's mind raced. She could feel the weight of the situation, the lives hanging in the balance. There was no easy way out of this. She had to act, and she had to act fast. "Walker," she whispered, her voice low but urgent. "Stay with me. We're getting out of this." The Marshal's eyes fluttered open, his voice barely a whisper. "You can't outrun them. They're relentless." "I don't need to outrun them," Merrill replied with a determined smile. "I just need to keep them distracted long enough for you to get away." Her plan wasn't perfect, but it was the only chance they had. She knew the terrain better than anyone, and if she could use the environment to her advantage, they might just have a shot. The leader of the bounty hunters stepped closer, his rifle now aimed directly at Merrill. "Last chance, lady," he growled. Merrill's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "I don't think you want to kill us." The bounty hunter paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing the situation. He didn't know what she was up to, but there was something in the air that made him hesitate. It was just enough time. Merrill didn't wait for him to make the next move. She pulled the revolver from its holster in one smooth motion and fired. The shot rang out, the sound sharp and echoing across the canyon. The leader staggered back, his rifle falling from his hands as he clutched his shoulder. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. "Go!" Merrill shouted to the Marshal, pushing them toward the creek. "Now!" The other bounty hunters shouted in surprise, scrambling to draw their weapons. Merrill had only seconds to make her move. She ducked low, using the natural cover of the rocks and the brush to her advantage. She moved quickly, but not without her share of close calls. A bullet whizzed past her ear, the sharp snap of the shot sending a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The marshland was just ahead, the creek winding its way through the canyon. Merrill knew if they could make it there, they'd have a chance to disappear into the wilderness. The dense vegetation would hide them, and the winding paths would throw off any pursuit. But they had to get there first. Walker, weak and stumbling, struggled to keep up. Merrill supported him as best as she could, but his legs were shaking, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The poison from the arrow wound was still working its way through his body, and the blood loss had drained him of his strength. "We're almost there," Merrill muttered, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. The bounty hunters were behind them now, shouting orders to each other. Meryl didn't dare look back, but she could hear the sounds of them gaining ground, their hooves pounding against the earth. They weren't far behind, and Meryl knew they wouldn't stop until they had captured both of them. She glanced at the Marshal, his face twisted in pain but determined. "We're not giving up," she said, more to herself than to him. "We're going to make it out of this." They reached the edge of the creek, and Meryl helped walk her down the slippery rocks, the cold water rushing around their feet. The sound of the water rushing over the stones was deafening, but Meryl didn't stop to listen. She had to keep moving. Suddenly, a voice from behind them made her freeze. "Stop right there!" It was one of the bounty hunters, his voice filled with anger and frustration. Meryl didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, focusing on the route that would take them deeper into the canyon. They were almost there. They could make it, but then there was a shout, a loud, urgent call that sent a jolt of fear through her. The sound of galloping hooves drew closer. Too close. The hunters weren't giving up. Meryl pushed Walker ahead of her, urging him to keep moving. "Just a little farther," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the water. She wasn't sure how much farther they could go, but the canyon was their last hope. If they could get deep enough, the terrain would give them the cover they needed to escape. They just had to hold on. As the sound of the hunters' hooves drew near, Meryl's mind raced. There had to be something she could do, something to throw them off the trail. Then she remembered the old cave. It was a long shot, but it was their best chance. It wasn't far from the creek, and it was hidden by a thick thicket of trees. If she could get there, they might be able to hide long enough for the bounty hunters to give up the chase. She grabbed Walker's arm, pulling him toward the cave. "This way," she urged. The sound of pursuit grew louder, but Meryl didn't look back. They were almost there. Meryl's heart hammered in her chest as she dragged Marshal Walker through the thick brush, the creek's cold water rushing beneath their feet. The sounds of the bounty hunters' pursuit were growing louder, the sound of galloping horses and shouted commands making it clear that the chase wasn't over yet. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of their footsteps echoing behind her. Time was running out. "Keep moving, Walker," she urged, her voice strained. "We're almost there." Walker, his breathing shallow and labored, nodded weakly, trying to keep his feet steady on the slippery rocks. The poison from the arrow wound had spread through his body, weakening him with every step. His eyes were barely open, but he was still trying. Meryl could see the effort in his face, the way he clenched his jaw against the pain. She wouldn't let him give up. Not now. The cave she had remembered was just ahead. It wasn't much, but it was a hiding place, and right now, that's all they needed. The entrance was tucked beneath a series of boulders, hidden by the thick trees that lined the canyon walls. The overgrowth was dense, providing perfect cover. She had used the cave before, long ago, when she needed to escape a dust storm, or when the land felt too quiet, too empty. But today, it wasn't the storm that was chasing them. It was a group of cold-blooded killers. Meryl pushed Walker toward the cave entrance, her muscles aching from the effort, but she didn't stop. They couldn't afford to stop. Once inside the cave, she helped Walker down onto the cold stone floor. The darkness was thick, but it provided them with a momentary shield. The sound of the creek outside was muffled here, the water's rush turning into a soft hum. It was hard to believe the world outside was so close, so dangerous. In the quiet, the pain in Meryl's chest began to settle. They had bought themselves a moment, but it wouldn't last. The sounds of the bounty hunters' horses reached the edge of the cave. Meryl pressed her back against the stone wall, her eyes narrowing as she listened. The hunters were still too close. She couldn't let them find her. They couldn't let them find Walker. She pulled her revolver from her holster, checking the chamber. Only 2 shots left. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The bounty hunters were closing in, and Meryl knew they'd be searching the canyon, looking for any sign of where they had gone. She had to buy them time, as much as she could. "They're coming," she muttered, her eyes scanning the darkness. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, and for a moment she almost felt the weight of the entire canyon on her shoulders. This was it. There was no going back. Walker stirred, his voice faint but urgent. "You need to go."
"Leave me. They won't stop until they have me."
Meryl shook her head, her hand on his shoulder, trying to steady him. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "Not now. We're getting out of here together." The Marshal didn't argue, but his eyes were filled with doubt. He knew the reality of their situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running on borrowed time. The bounty hunters would search every inch of the canyon if they had to. But Meryl wasn't about to let that happen. She wasn't going to let them win. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer. They were here. Meryl took a deep breath and moved toward the entrance of the cave, peering through the narrow opening. The bounty hunters were riding past, their figures dark against the rising sun. The leader was the first to pass, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat. He was followed by 4 others, all armed and determined. They were searching for something, anything, that could lead them to their prey. Meryl's grip tightened on her revolver as she watched them ride by. If she was careful, if she stayed out of sight, they might pass without noticing her. But if they caught a glimpse of her, if they knew she was still there... The leader suddenly stopped his horse, his head turning toward the cave entrance. Meryl's breath caught in her throat. Had they seen her? "Spread out," the leader barked, his voice low but commanding. "Check the trees. Check the creek." They can't have gone far. The other bounty hunters immediately fanned out, moving toward the trees and the creek, searching the ground for any sign of where Marshal and the Marshal had gone. Meryl pulled back into the cave, her heart racing. There was no more time to hide. They were going to find them, and it was only a matter of time before they reached the entrance. Her mind raced. She could hear their footsteps now, crunching on the dry earth, getting closer. The tension in her chest was almost unbearable. There was no more running, no more hiding. They were going to have to fight. Meryl grabbed Walker's hand, helping him to his feet. "We can't stay here," she whispered urgently. "We need to move." The Marshal's eyes were unfocused, but he nodded weakly. He wasn't going to last much longer, but he was still fighting, still holding on. That gave Meryl the strength she needed. Together, they made their way deeper into the cave, toward the back. The sounds of the bounty hunters were growing louder, their voices mixing with the sound of hooves. Then Meryl heard it. A single shot rang out, sharp and echoing through the canyon. She froze. The shot wasn't aimed at her. It wasn't even close. But it was close enough to make her heart skip a beat. She knew the bounty hunters had started to shoot to flush them out. "We can't stay here," Meryl repeated, her voice low and steady. Walker looked at her, his face pale and drawn. "You have to get out. I'm slowing you down." Meryl shook her head, her grip tightening around his arm. "We're in this together." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps reached the cave entrance. Meryl didn't have much time to think. She took one last look at the Marshal, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. There was no easy way out of this, no simple escape. But she wasn't going to leave him behind, not after everything. "Get ready," she whispered. The footsteps grew louder. They were almost at the entrance. Meryl knew what had to happen next. She had to buy them time. One last stand. With a deep breath, she moved toward the cave's narrow exit, her revolver held firmly in her hand. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew this: she would not let the bounty hunters take him.